What's up? You're listening to The Long Game, and I'm your host, David Lee Kim, co-founder of Omniscient Digital. In this episode, we chat with Jenny Tai. Jenny is the head of content at Vanta, a platform that helps fast-growing companies build, scale, and demonstrate their security and compliance programs and get ready for audits in weeks, not months. Jenny has an extensive background in content with over a decade of experience building and executing content programs at high-growth SaaS companies like Asana, Dropbox, Clearbit, and Yammer. At Vanta, she's focused on growing the brand and the business through content. In this conversation, we talk about the evolution of content over the last 10 years, including various hype cycles. We touch a lot on the idea of building a media company, and hint, we aren't too big of a fan of that. She also shares how she thinks about content strategy. We had a very timely conversation about how folks in content should think about pivoting as we see many companies going through repositioning exercises, going after a new ICP, or changing their go-to-market share. We also touched on one of the key principles we have at Omniscient Digital, which is to level up the content universe. A key way we see of doing this is improving executive communication around content programs, and Jenny shared exactly what she presents in executive meetings. I think you're going to learn a ton from this episode. Here's my conversation with Jenny Tai. Jenny, welcome to The Long Game.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, so today we're going to be talking a lot about content. And from my research, your career started before 2011, but 2011 is when your content career started. So what led you to content marketing? Because 2011 content marketing was a relatively
I always
new
tell
thing
people I ended up in
still.
content
So
marketing
what were the
and in
things that
tech
led you
pretty
there?
much by accident. So before I started my first content, and really it was a writing role, I would say content marketing was just starting to become a thing at the time. I had this whole pre-life in law and in academia, and neither path really worked out. And so when I decided to leave grad school, this was at the end of 2010, I kind of had this moment of freak out where I'm like, oh my God, my 5-year plan after college didn't work out. What do I do now?
You had one of those too.
And so I think for me, I was kind of in the, right time, right place. I grew up in the Bay Area, so I was already living in San Francisco. And that was around the time, this sounds so dated now, that like Web 2.0 was taking off again in San Francisco. And so my first job in tech, I found on Craigslist. I saw a posting saw a posting looking for, they called it a technical marketing writer. And it was like a part-time contract gig. But they were looking for someone to basically write SEO content. I put that in air quotes. Write SEO content for the marketing team. So this was MuleSoft. Again, found the job on Craigslist. It was a contract gig. I got it. And again, that was like my first foray into tech, which happened kind of by accident. But I think in retrospect, my time in grad school helped a lot because part of the, I had no prior technical software knowledge, prior to that job. But part of my grad school program was just reading lots of books every week, like thousands of pages on topics I had no familiarity with, and then being able to like talk and write about it like semi-intelligently. So that helped a lot with that first job because I think I had to do a writing test, if I recall, as part of the interview process, and I got it. MuleSoft has since gone public, been acquired by Salesforce. They do basically cloud integration. So I went from studying use history to writing articles about cloud integration. And that's how the journey began.
I love it. I almost went down academia. I have a chemistry undergrad degree, and there was a period where I was like, maybe I want to be Asian, like maybe I want to be a doctor or like a pharmacist. And then I was like, maybe I'll get a PhD. And I did a year of undergrad research, and I was like, yeah, this isn't for me. And then by that time, it was senior year. I'm like, okay, let me just graduate. I also got my first marketing job off Craigslist, and it was an SEO marketing internship. I was pretty much just doing like link building and like editing content that was probably written like by offshore writers. And I'm like, Oh,
Yeah,
wow.
no, I mean, I feel like we were on the other side of the coin, which is like for my job, I would get a list of keywords every week, and then I would write articles for each of the keywords. A lot of them were like pretty similar. Again, I wasn't, didn't have deep subject matter expertise in the topics, but was able to kind of compose these articles and get them out live. But the great thing about that job was that even though it started off just with writing content for SEO, I was able to kind of start taking on other projects and just like generalist writing work from the marketing team. So from there, I ended up getting to work with the PMM team to write some white papers that were used for demand gen. I think I ended up editing the email newsletter and some like technical content for the blog. And then we had a PR consultant at the time, and I ended up working with her and the co-founder and CTO to write like exec bylines. And so that was really fun. So I kind of just got like a crash course in how to do, do marketing communications with this first job. And again, it was part-time, it was contracting, but I learned a lot just from that first Craigslist job.
It's a great first marketing job coming from academia. That's awesome.
Yeah, no, I felt super lucky to have that chance to just learn so much.
Yeah. So a lot has changed since the early days of like 2011 content. So I guess for you, looking back at how content has evolved, like what are the big changes that you've been witnessing and have found most interesting? Maybe you can touch on the recent changes.
Yeah, totally. So what I was saying earlier, where when I first got that first job, I feel like content marketing was just becoming a thing, specifically in B2B SaaS. But I think, mid-aughts up until kind of like the mid 2010s, it's really like the blogging era. That's like Web 2.0. Everyone's writing a lot of blog content. I really kind of see HubSpot as the model for how content marketing is done. You're writing a lot of articles, optimized for search, bring folks to your website. And then as we kind of progress down that road, then you start thinking about, demand gen tactics. Then it's like, again, HubSpot's a great model here. They brought folks in, get them in, through their subscriber lists, put up offers that get that email address. Marketo was doing a lot around this time in the early 2010s around like Marketing Nation. I definitely downloaded a lot of their ebooks when I was trying to like figure out what this content marketing thing was. And then I would say around the time I joined Asana, so this was like 2016, my sense is that a lot of brands, especially in the B2B side, we're seeing SEO, they're seeing, all these ebooks being, published, and you're like, how do we actually differentiate and do something different and maybe just like elevate the quality of the marketing content being put out? And so I think around that time, you see a lot of quote unquote brand journalism, right? Or like editorial like approaches to doing B2B content. So Asana actually launched an initiative when I was there called Wavelength, which I spearheaded when I joined. Zendesk also had something like called Relate. So this was like taking more of like a magazine approach to creating content. And, there's some great consumer examples too, where, Airbnb had Pineapple magazine. We definitely drew from that as inspiration. And then I think around kind of late 2010s, there's also pivot to video, especially interest in media in general. And then I would say, where we're at now is super interesting. I actually think people almost feel overwhelmed by just the sheer amount of content out there. Not only are brands creating content, you just have creators. And so there's just so much info out there. It's hard to tell what's like legit or credible or useful. So what I'm seeing a lot now is what I'm calling community-driven content. It's really like newsletters, lots of Substacks where you have a single kind of like thought leader or expert sharing what they know. And it's to a very specific niche audience that wants to know, like, learn from them. And I think a lot of that is also happening on LinkedIn. There's a lot of just native content being shared in feed. And then I would say a lot of content is being shared in just private communities. Like, I'm in so many Slack channels of like from folks across my network, and we're always just kind of like sharing ideas and information and just like tips on how to like think through something. So I think that's kind of where where we are now. We're kind of gone from like, mass blogging, ebooks to kind of this elevated brand journalism to now like really going back to kind of like a small batch approach to content almost.
Yeah. What about, I'm kind of like jumping around a little bit, but there's a lot about like media marketing, like building a media company. Like, you didn't mention that. I'm curious if you have any thoughts on that
I think the media company kind of approach kind of falls under that brand journalism editorial bucket. I would say in the last year or so, there's definitely more I guess, direct, communication around like, we're building a media company. I think HubSpot acquired some properties.
Yeah.
I think at the end of the day, it really kind of goes back to, like what you're trying to achieve. I don't think it's a good approach to create a media company or build a media company for the sake of building one. It really just goes back to what's your business objective? What is this going to do for your marketing growth? And then kind of build the kind of media company strategy accordingly. I think, kind of from what I've observed, sometimes it's very easy for the whole notion of, let's build a media company just to become like a shiny object and a distraction because it sounds like cool and interesting and different. But if it's not grounded and aligned with what you're actually trying to achieve from a business or marketing perspective, it could be like a big waste of time and effort and money. And I think it's for a couple of reasons. In kind of from what I've observed, oftentimes when companies or leaders are like, we want to build a media company, we're still kind of like using the model of what like the old legacy model of what a media company is like, right? It's like the thinking is that if you build your own media company, you can create an engaged audience that you can market your products and services to. Like, that's a great premise. In practice, it doesn't work out that way. It's really hard and expensive to build an audience because our distribution channels are so fragmented now. I'm like, if like new media companies or like the darlings of Web 2.0 like BuzzFeed can't really hack it anymore, like what makes you think you can do it, So I think it's very easy to kind of rush into that shiny object versus really taking a step back to be like, wait, like what are we actually getting into? What is distribution going to look like? If you build it, people won't necessarily come because the distribution channels are so fragmented and kind of hard to crack now.
That is fascinating. I'm kind of getting chills, which I get when I have a realization, but like I haven't heard it reframed in that way before. That I agree that it could be a shiny object, and a lot of people on LinkedIn are talking about how everyone needs to be building a media company, and like we fell for it. We started a podcast, which we were already going to do, but then we started doing like virtual events and like ongoing like large webinars and stuff. And we're like, wait, is this really what we should be spending our time on? Like, what's the ROI here? It's hard to build an audience. And you're right. If BuzzFeed can't figure it out, if like these other media companies can't seem to get it right,
and they're media experts.
What makes any like B2B marketing team think they can build a media arm within as a side project?
To kind of what I was saying about the like evolution of content marketing, right? So like when during the Web 2.0 era when it was just about blogging, you could, basically the main distribution channels were SEO, RSS feeds, and then people just going directly to your site. And then when you had mobile at Facebook take off, that's when you get these walled gardens of distribution channels where, Facebook is going to want to own where people kind of find out and consume content. And then Google's trying to kind of create their own walled garden around, organic and mostly paid search. And so it became super fragmented, where, the New York Times essentially had to build out a digital strategy because they didn't have that direct distribution channel, and where it was all fragmented across, search and social, basically.
Yeah. I think the thing I'm trying to grasp as well is if we're talking about building these media properties as a B2B SaaS company, in my mind, you're not watching media, like you're not watching a documentary during your workday. Like that's not work.
Yeah.
But I would probably consume something like that outside of work. But then you're competing with like Netflix and Instagram and all the other
why
places.
are you trying to compete with like actual media companies?
Yeah.
And I think actually, now that I'm connecting the dots in my head, I think that's probably why people are gravitating towards like Substack and LinkedIn and just like their own private, closed, Slack communities, because it's more of a direct to consumer approach where, you're just getting it straight from the expert versus trying to navigate all these disparate, distribution channels to find the content that's actually going to be relevant to you.
Yeah. So you had mentioned this, we talked about this evolution of content throughout maybe the last decade and a half or so, which is crazy to think personally that I've been in this space for that long. But so you were previously at Clearbit, Asana, Dropbox, Microsoft, MuleSoft, some household names in B2B, I think, at this point. Yeah. And right now you're head of content at Vanta. So what are you focused on now with all these options for shiny objects? What's the team at Vanta focused on?
Yeah, so I love this question because I'm super excited about Vanta. So I joined a couple months ago at a really exciting time for the company. They started off in 2018, really as the first product on the market to automate the compliance process for SOC 2. So every SaaS company goes through this process at some point where you have to, kind of go through your SOC 2 audit. It's typically a very manual and painful process, and Vanta, had this brilliant product idea to automate the entire thing. And so I'm joining at a really exciting time where the company is evolving and elevating its positioning. So we've built out the what we're calling a trust managed platform to extend the capabilities of the product to go beyond just compliance, but also enabling teams to kind of scale out their security and compliance programs, and then go a step further and actually demonstrate that they're secure and trustworthy externally, all on the same platform. So that's super cool from a content perspective, because what they were doing in 2018 when they were just automated compliance isn't going to serve the growth needs of the company anymore, right? We have a new positioning, new story. We're entering new markets. So that means, I get to do a really exciting job in terms of kind of evolving and kind of elevating the kind of, foundational content strategy to kind of help fuel the company's, kind of growth ambitions through content.
That sounds like a lot happening all at once, we're hearing it, I'm hearing it from other peers and even our clients, new positioning, new market, new ICP. And you're kind of in this position where you kind of help shepherd a lot of those changes through the content that you and your team are going to be producing. Does that scare you? Is any of a part of that kind of overwhelming?
No, and here's why. Because I went through this process during my 6 years at Asana. So there's part of me where I'm okay, I've been around this rodeo once before. It was definitely scary the first time, but now that I've gone through it once, I'm okay, I have a sense of kind of what to look out for, what to avoid now, what to kind of think ahead of now. And so even though it sounds like a lot, I'm bring it on. This is fun.
Yeah. So I love that. And I love that you're just nope, not scared. I've already seen this before. I can think of a few specific people, I have their faces in my mind right now where I'm they're going through this right now. And I'm I know that they're a bit concerned about how challenging it's going to be. What are some of the things that you, if you were speaking to someone in your same position going through it for the first time, what are the things you might tell them to keep an eye out for, consider thinking about or expect?
I think, when I think especially about my time at Asana, A big part of it is being adaptable and nimble, and then also kind of leaning into. I love a pilot program. So like as the companies, going through each stage of growth and like you're shifting the go-to-market, you're shifting your positioning. It can be really overwhelming because you're like, oh God, I have to like start from scratch again. Like this is gonna be so much work. It's actually not. You have, again, like you're not necessarily starting from zero. There's a lot of existing kind of process and programs that you can still draw from. It's kind of repurposing that and kind of taking it the next step. If you are doing something net new, start small. You don't need to like rebuild the entire machine like from scratch. It's certainly not going to happen overnight. But yeah, pilot a project over like a couple months or a quarter, work out the kinks in terms of process and then, kind of measure the impact before you then scale out to be like, okay, this thing works. We're now going to scale it to, across the company and across the regions. So I would say that's like number one is just like start small. It feels really daunting. You just break it down into like the next immediate step and then you'll kind of like get to where you need to be. I would say the other one is, especially for folks who, especially for content teams, you're always getting asked from like across the company, I need this, I need that. Prioritize. And again, map it back to what is the company or team really focused on for like this month, this quarter, this year, and say yes to the things that are going to impact that or that you think are going to move the needle on that, and say no to everything else and explain why. I think that's what's ultimately going to keep you sane is just to prioritize ruthlessly against, what the company or the team's trying to achieve. So I think those are kind of the two big ones. I guess the third would be, I'm a big fan of process. I think that comes from working at Asana for 6 years. But the more you can kind of streamline and kind of nail down any repetitive processes, and for content, that's definitely the case. Like a blog post or an ebook typically goes through the same sequence of steps. The more you can kind of nail that down and make it super efficient and then replicate it across all your deliverables, the better. Like I always use this metaphor around a Tupperware drawer. If you have containers that don't match, different shapes, you're not going to be able to fit all your Tupperware containers in the drawer. But if they're, the same shape, preferably from the same manufacturer, you can stack them and stack a bunch of them in the same drawer. And so that's kind of how I approach like the content production process is you want to be able to like predict how that process is going to go, because then that's going to make you much more efficient and make it easier to scale across all your different markets and programs.
I love that. So that was like start small, like don't get overwhelmed by like everything you eventually have to do. Like what's the next step, and like prioritize ruthlessly, and then like use process to your advantage to like streamline a lot. I'm curious about the like starting small in the pilot program, right? Because I feel there's the whole like do more with less thing going on right now. And what I'm hearing is lots of leadership might be like, we got to move fast, and folks who are on the front lines and doing like running these programs might be like, oh, there's so much to do. So like, what's an example maybe you can use from Asana or that you're doing at Vanta?
Yeah, actually I had one in mind as you were asking the question.
Perfect.
So Asana, this was like towards the end of my time there, but, Asana's early days, we grew a lot via, I would say word of mouth and, paid acquisition. And so when I first joined, we actually didn't do a lot of SEO because our primary growth levers were word of mouth and paid. And then cut to, 5.5 years later, we're now a public company. I had been there for, a while, and like our go-to-market strategy evolved where we were both PLG and doing like a sales-led motion. So it was like a hybrid business. And we were trying to kind of figure out, okay, like how do we continue to kind of, maintain our product-led growth while continuing to invest in the sales-led side. And so we were like, SEO. We need to think about how to kind of unlock organic growth. So as you can imagine, in the 5 years, like after, I joined, our competitors in the space had done a lot with SEO. So we basically just had to like catch up super fast. And so around that time, we, up until that point, we had worked with agencies for SEO, but then the team, brought in, hired some roles, for SEO in-house. And then they were like, okay, well, we need content now. What do we do? So in my case, what I ended up doing on the content side was we scoped out essentially a pilot for an initial quarter with just one in-house writer. And we worked with our in-house head of organic growth and our amazing SEO manager to basically align on, okay, where do we think, like, what are the kind of priority keywords that we want to kind of test out essentially, where we think we can make the most impact. And then kind of, on the content side, like how quickly can we actually produce this content without sacrificing quality? Because again, we had basically had to catch up on 5 years of like not doing, dedicated SEO. And so I had one, full-time writer in-house at the time. And we basically scoped out like a 3-month, just one quarter. What can we achieve in that one quarter with one writer and like one SEO manager kind of doing the day-to-day? Scoped it out. We were able to like deliver, the content that we, like established as the goal at the beginning of the quarter. And then from there, that kind of basically was like a proof of concept. Be like, hey, we can produce still high quality content that ranks. Maybe it's time to scale this out. So then the following year, we got approval for a pretty hefty budget to then scale out the team. So the following year, we hired, we ended up hiring 3 additional full-time folks, I believe, and then brought on an agency to help us scale out the kind of production side of things and just basically chip away at our keyword list and it's that team is still doing a lot of that work and a lot of the content is still doing really well. So that's kind of how we were able to scale up SEO basically in say like 10 months.
I love that story, and I particularly like how you tied in like, we tested it out, we proved value, and then we like got budget. And I at least from the conversations I've been a part of, it doesn't seem like that's a common discussion being had in content of like, hey, how do we prove the value and like get budget? And this is just from observing people like in content roles getting laid off at like some pretty well-known companies. And
well, like, and I think in our case, like the leadership team was very much like, we want to invest in SEO. I was actually the one that was like, wait, I don't know how to spend all this money yet. Like, let me make sure that like I feel comfortable, like, kind of managing this process and that we know that it's going to like go smoothly. And so I think, it's as the person that's going to be, kind of managing and spending that budget, I wanted to be like a responsible spender as well.
Wow. You're ahead of your time before everyone is now like being careful about spend.
Yeah.
So I listened to your interview with Emily Kramer on the MKT1 podcast, and this is related to what you were just talking about, but you had this phrase, I think it was content splattergy versus content strategy. And I think you also said you didn't come up with this, someone else did. I forgot who you got it from, but tell us more about like that thing. Like, what is content splattergy?
The word splattergy comes from someone I worked with at Yammer years ago. And the basic idea is that I think especially for a lot of folks who've worked in fast moving startups where things are changing a lot, sometimes you get into this moment where you feel like, oh, we're just kind of like doing a lot of things and throwing things at the wall to see what sticks. And so that's basically what content splattergy is when you are creating a lot of content for the sake of content, not really clear how these map back to larger marketing or company objectives. And so I think sometimes it's very easy to fall into that, especially if you're brought into a content role and the kind of operating model is that the content function or team is like an intake function where you're just here to kind of service requests from different parts of the team or the company. And so I think one way to kind of move away from a splattergy where it feels like you're just cranking out some stuff day in and day out is to really kind of be really try to understand what the company's overall like corporate strategy is. And then kind of what the marketing strategy is. Like you can't really develop a content strategy in a vacuum. It really needs to have a strong anchor around like the go-to-market, and then you kind of design around that. Because again, if your company is product-led versus sales-led, content's going to look very different. And so, you really want to kind of be a good kind of observer of like, okay, how does the business actually run? How does it make money? Where can we fit content into that equation?
Yeah, I love that a lot. I run into that. And one of my friends, David Filarme, who was on the pod, he talked about it more generally of marketing teams having like randomitis, like let us do paid and let us do social and content and all these other things without really having a focus. So I guess maybe if we narrow in on like content splattergy, how do you recommend, or how have you in the past like built content strategy from scratch? And I think in your previous interview or just now you said aligning it with the go-to-market motion and like the business goals and like the business model. Like what's an example?
I'll kind of use Asana as an example, and then kind of how that experience informed the way I built out strategies at Clearbit and then now at Vanta. So again, I was at Asana for close to 6 years. And it kind of went through, several growth spurts where I was there, and at kind of each stage that meant the content strategy had to evolve. So when I started, Emily Kramer, was head of marketing. We were primarily product led. And I remember coming in with like kind of like a playbook in my head of how to do content marketing. Cause again, HubSpot was like the model. So I come in thinking like, oh, we're going to like do a bunch of ebooks and like get leads and then nurture them and they'll become customers. And then I get there and Emily Kramer was like, we don't gate content here. And I was like, what? Like, what do you mean we don't gate content? And so I was leading the blog, and then we ended up doing Wavelength. And I remember being like, wait, but how do we convert? Yeah. And then I had this light bulb moment where I was like, oh, we are like a free to pay product. So it was like the gated content is the free product. And that's when the light bulb went off for me. I was like, oh, okay. So our content strategy there was, all ungated. It was a lot of, we did thought leadership, we did some top of funnel, but really top of funnel again was driven primarily by paid acquisition, and then you get folks in via free sign up. And then we actually did a lot of like product education. So we had a person on the content team that owned all of our kind of user education around lots of use cases and best practices for implementing the product. And then we also did a lot of just like product marketing content. So this is actually my favorite content to write, is actually like product launch announcements and explaining the value prop. And then those were big drivers of like product stickiness and then conversion to paid. So that was kind of like act one when I was there. Then a couple years along, when we started kind of layering in like a hybrid motion, that's when we did our first piece of gated content. That didn't happen until, like 2 years into my time at Asana. And it was because we were trying to go after, larger companies with like more of a like buying committee process. And so that's when that happened. And then by the time I left, it became this kind of layered approach where we had, that scaled SEO to kind of drive that top of funnel awareness and get folks in via, kind of the free sign up flow. We had kind of more of a traditional sales led, kind of ebook motion and nurture. And then we were trying to layer on, it was like kind of full circle. We like layered back on exec thought leadership, where we were trying to tap into, third-party publications, both like paid and earned, to kind of get some exec thought leadership out in the wild. So, it was really fun to kind of navigate during those 6 years. I think the big learning from that was like, you really have to align the content to whatever motion you're trying to, execute. And so when I, joined Clearbit and then Vanta, first thing I did was not do any content. Basically, I always spend the first, at least 3 weeks just trying to understand what is the go-to-market motion, what's our positioning, what does the competitive landscape look like, and then maybe I'll start getting into a content audit to understand, like, okay, where are we today? Where do we want to go? And then I kind of develop the content strategy.
Yeah.
But yeah, I really love Emily Kramer's fuel engine kind of framing for how to think about content. Again, you don't want it just to create content to have it. It really needs to be the fuel for whatever, kind of marketing channels you're trying to leverage. So that's kind of how I think about building a content strategy.
Yeah, I love that. And you mentioned executive thought leadership. And one thing I've started noticing people do is we want like some SEO content and we want some thought leadership content. And I'm like, I'm curious what your take on this. And I'm like, why are you separating the two? Like,
yeah,
you're talking about SEO content is like,
because I feel like my thoughts on this have evolved as well. I think when people say SEO content, and I'm putting that in quotes, there's this connotation that it's going to be low quality. It's like keyword stuffing. I definitely feel like in my early days felt like I was writing some of that myself.
100%.
And especially now with like AI, you're like, is this even a human writing this? So yeah, I think there's a connotation around SEO content that it's written for the purpose of ranking organically. And I think that's not the right way to think about it. You should create content for your target audience, write for who you want to reach, give them value. And then SEO is like the distribution mechanism. That's how you make sure that you are getting in front of the eyeballs you want to reach. So yeah, I hear that all the time. I'm like, no, it's not. I mean, I'm guilty of using it too, but yeah, I think when you say SEO content, there's this perception that's like, oh, the content's not going to be good. And so that's why I think people are like, oh, but we want to do thought leadership because that's elevated. That's, that's going to be high quality. But I think similarly, the term thought leadership gets overused so often now that I don't know that it actually means anything anymore. I think everyone.
What does it mean?
Who knows? I've seen it mean everything from just any, like, some might call it SEO content. I've had some people refer to that as thought leadership. I think the broadest definition I've come across is that it's basically anything that's like product agnostic, right? But I think I have a higher bar for thought leadership. And I think I said this on Emily's podcast, which is that you can't really do thought leadership if you don't have like interesting thoughts, right? And so I think if you're really gonna try to lean into thought leadership, you have to spend a lot of like time up front thinking through, okay, what is kind of like your unique perspective on a particular industry or topic area. And like, do you actually have like insight to share? I think that's like the bar.
Yeah.
And again, that feels very subjective, but not everything's thought leadership, even though everyone's calling it thought leadership.
Yeah, we've started trying to help some of our clients with that because we'd be like, well, what thought leadership, like what thoughts do you want us to write about?
Yeah, exactly.
And they'd be like, oh, we're not sure. And so we started doing this like brand point of view workshop where it's
exactly.
Well, surely someone in executive leadership, maybe your CEO has some strong opinions or like hot takes about the industry or like how the product should be built and what competitors are doing wrong. Like those are all thoughts. Like it shouldn't be coming. I don't believe it should come from the marketing team. I think it needs to come from someone who's like really like
someone with expertise, experience in the in the field who can kind of offer their perspective on what's going on in the industry or the market. Like it should not the head of content should not be making up the thoughts for a thought leadership program.
Yeah, but it's fascinating too because I think the way you just posed it, like, well, what thoughts do we have? Like, if you pose that to the executive team, what we found is sometimes they even have like conflicting opinions, and we're like, this is a good thing. Like, let's get alignment on like what the outward facing positions and thoughts are, and like internally, like now we have things that probably the team should align on. But.
Yeah, I mean, I think I I actually kind of, use my experience in academia to kind of think about what thought leadership should be, which is that,
Yeah.
when you're, let's say working on your dissertation, basically you spend like, I don't know, 5, especially in history, which is what I studied. You spend, your first couple years reading everything in your field about, a particular topic. And then when you write your dissertation, you're trying to find that like sliver, that white space, in between everything else that has already been said about your field to offer like that one unique take that no one has thought of before. And I feel like that's how you should approach thought leadership. It's like, what are others in the space or the conversation talking about? It doesn't even necessarily have to be your direct competitors. It's just commentators, what is the media covering right now? And then you kind of need to figure out what's going to be unique about your perspective and what you're adding to that conversation, because otherwise it's just going to feel like noise or like, oh, like that's already been said.
Yeah. Yeah. You mentioned something else that was interesting. You said like they're in the first, couple weeks, 3 weeks of the role, you're not producing content, which makes a lot of sense to me. When we work with clients, we're like, just letting you know, we don't produce anything for the first month. Like we got to onboard, like again, we're a third party like vendor. We got to like understand your positioning, interview your SMEs to like know what thoughts you have and your positioning and all of that. But we often get a lot of folks saying like, great, when can we start producing? Like, we don't want a strategy. We just want to produce. And we're like, oh, that's not a good recipe for success.
Yeah,
let's step back here. Yeah. Like, you don't want to just throw us stuff to write without us knowing what your strategy is and aligning first. Like it's for your benefit. What I thought was interesting was you talking about building out strategy from scratch for Asana, Clearbit, and now Vanta. What I'm curious about is when you're communicating like the content programs and the value of the programs to like executive stakeholders, like in the meetings with all of leadership. What do your presentations look like? Like what's on those slides? Like
I'm trying to figure out
like how
I love making a slide. I think that's actually another one of my favorite content formats is making slides. I think the big thing that I try to do is I always kind of start with the why, right? I think the last few roles I had definitely with Asana and a Clearbit. I try to have like a high level just vision for the content team and kind of what we're trying to achieve. Extra points if you can tie it back to the company mission, because that's great. But I think at the end of the day, what I'm trying to do in the, kind of content strategy deck that I put together and share it with stakeholders is make it super clear, kind of how the content programs tie back to the company, company goals or the marketing objectives, right? And then that way, up front, I've been bringing people along the journey around, okay, this is why we're doing X and not, Y, versus just starting with a laundry list of like, these are all the blog posts and ebooks we're going to publish in the next quarter. Yeah. It's really, let's take a step back, super high level, why are we here? what are we trying to accomplish? And just, really connect the dots between specific programs to specific company objectives. So using Asana as an example, again, the last year, when I was there, we kind of, went full circle again back to, building out like executive thought leadership. That was really tied to, trying to push further upmarket into enterprises. It was, really, hey, I don't think a, C-suite executive, enterprise company is going to be downloading an ebook. Like, how do we reach them where they are? And so we're like, okay, executive thought leadership is where it's at. And so through, we want to show up in like top tier media publications where we're more likely to kind of reach, that enterprise, kind of buyer versus, promoting an ebook. So again, it's really tied back to, okay, what are the objectives?
Yeah. Yeah. I really appreciate even just starting a conversation with like why we're here. Here's the business goals and here's how we roll up, rather than starting with here's the content we publish and here's the traffic. It's like, before we get to the metrics, like let's make sure that that's all put into context. And
yeah, and when my high level outline for a strategy deck is actually pretty straightforward. It doesn't need to be overly complicated. You're basically answering, the 5 W's and then the how. So it's like you start with why, then you talk about who, like who's the ISP persona, making sure that you're aligned with like CMM, demand gen, that these are the right, segments. Then you kind of get into the what, like what are the content types that we're going to prioritize? What are the key themes? Getting into the where, so distribution channels are going to be really important. And then when would be like cadence. And then the last part would be the how. So it's all your process and operations. And that's basically it. Doesn't need to be super complicated. Just answer, those 5 W's and the how, and like that's your strategy.
I feel like you should make that into like a template for folks to follow. I think I've seen a lot of like complicated strategy descriptions. Like, wait, this sounds very convoluted, but you just made it very clear.
And I think, it's really easy. I mean, I've been guilty of it too. Like, because sometimes answering these questions can be really hard. Like answering why, who, getting alignment on that. It can be really hard to kind of like, it's a lot of conversation and getting on the same page. So it's much easier to like be like, hey, here's our content strategy, and it's like a list of things you're gonna write. The actual strategy, like artifact that I produce is like the culmination of that first month of like figuring out, understanding the go-to-market strategy, meeting with a lot of teams and understanding what they're focusing on. So even though the deck might not be super long or looks really simple, it's actually like a synthesis of all of that thinking that's been happening in the first month.
I also wonder if that sort of artifact sets strong guardrails for the content team to be able to say like, no to like the multitude of requests coming through. Like,
100%.
Does that align with our goals?
Yes.
Nope, we're not doing that.
Yeah, it's almost like, I have my strategy deck in my back pocket. So someone's like, oh, I want to build XYZ. I'm like, okay, well, let me walk you through kind of like how I think about content and, where our priorities are. Like, let's talk through where you might fit in. And that's, I think, a really useful, way to kind of have that discussion versus just being like, okay, like, what do you need? Sure, we'll do it, or no.
Yeah, I mean, and I'm kind of leveling a conversation up to like that area of like strategy and I guess more exec communications, because I've found that maybe for a lot of content marketers who tend to be individual contributors, it seems like there isn't really much coaching of like, hey, how do we talk about the value of our work rather than just like the blog posts we're publishing? And so what you're talking about here, I think, is what is necessary to level up the content marketing universe. Like, how do we arm more of the content marketers to speak at an executive level?
I think that kind of just goes back to like what the role or scope of the role for a content marketer is. I think early on it was like, oh, it's a writer. Let's hire someone who can like, produce things. But I, when I think about hiring folks onto my team, it's like, yes, you have to be like, a fabulous writer and storyteller and be able to articulate complex ideas clearly and make them compelling. And other competencies I really look for are that strategic thinking. And what I mean by that is, can you connect the work that you're doing, the content you're producing, back to a higher level goal that's gonna, help the company achieve its objectives? It's not just creating the content. It's how is it, helping us get from A to B. And then the third part would be, having a strong, I think just, operational sense and like systems thinking and being able to kind of help others navigate, the kind of content creation process. I think all three of those buckets are really important for content marketers.
Yeah, it's interesting, kind of tying back to what I first asked you to open up the conversation, how the content marketing like space has evolved, but so has the content marketing role, where it's no longer just writer. It's like expecting the business sense to tie your work to the business goals, and maybe even like some ops and like being able to manage the process and like stakeholder management. So it's interesting how as things have evolved, the content marketer, like maybe it's less of an emphasis on a content, though that's still important, but there's more emphasis on like the marketer and like having the business sense to have 100%. An impact.
And I think that to me is what is I think kind of how I kind of evolved. My role has evolved just in my career trajectory. I started like purely as a writer, and then as I kind of progressed and moved along, and when I started stepping into like management and like leadership roles, the difference was being able to map it back to the marketing and business goals, so that you then that way you're showing that you understand where the company's trying to go and how you're going to help the company get there with content versus just being like, we're over here slinging blog posts.
Yeah. I feel like I have a dozen more questions I can ask, but I know we're coming close to time, and I got some maybe questions to wrap up our conversation, some rapid fire. But before we get to those, is there anything else you'd like to share, maybe for folks who are hoping to be ahead of content in the future, or folks who might be in your position and like maybe working through some of the repositionings at their current companies? Like any additional things you'd like to add that we haven't gotten to cover?
I think the big thing is, again, I think if you're in like a startup environment or like hyper growth company, things are going to be changing like very quickly all the time. So the best way to kind of like stay ahead of that and be able to like skate to where the puck is just talk to as many people as possible, especially if you're in like a remote company, because the more kind of ambient awareness and knowledge that you can kind of pick up, the more you're able to, kind of pivot quickly and start like shifting your content activities to where they need to be versus like, being reactive when a decision has already made.
Yeah. Yeah. It's like, instead of just trying to figure things out on your own or within your like local team, like talk to others even outside the company to learn.
Yeah.
Love it.
Yeah, exactly.
All right. So how about some closing questions? So you can feel free to answer these with as short or as long as an answer as you'd like. And then we'll wrap it up.
Cool.
All right. So what's one opinion you have about business or marketing that you think people would disagree with?
I had two for these, but I'll share the first one, which is that I think execution is highly underrated. So I think, even when I was earlier in my career, my friends would always talk about like, oh, I want to own strategy. Like that's where it's at. It feels so interesting and elevated, and like, you've made it, or you're so senior. And then I've come around to that because now that I've been doing, more strategy, I'm like, oh, but the strategy, it does not matter if you can't execute. So I think execution is highly underrated. I think in a lot of organizations, and it's very easy to have a nice deck that looks and sounds great, but if you can't actually make it happen, then it's moot.
Fully agree with that. I was also in that camp of, I want to do strategy, and then realizing like, oh wait, someone needs to do the strategy. And one, if people aren't aligned, they're not going to help you with it. But sometimes you're a one person team and you just got to make it happen.
Yeah, exactly.
All right. What's one impactful piece of advice you've been given?
So I was thinking about this, and the one that I hear a lot just from like past managers and even peers is just to speak up, which, I think for me, it doesn't come naturally necessarily. I definitely am more of an introvert. There's a reason why I'm a content person and not like a public speaker. I'm definitely, prefer to, sit in meetings and kind of observe and process quietly. And one of my former managers at Asana was like, you really should just share that more, because like it's doing a disservice to the team if you're not, part of the conversation and helping to kind of shape, the plan or the strategy. And so that's the one that I kind of keep going back to. It sounds very simple, but I think for my, kind of career, that's been really impactful.
Yeah. How did you work on that?
I think for me, again, I'm not someone that, will initiate, conversation if I don't have to. For me, it was almost taking like a middle step of, okay, if I'm not comfortable speaking in the moment in a meeting, then I will kind of like take notes, process, and then come back and share with the team later. And maybe it's through like, a quick message or whatever. And so just starting to kind of figure out what felt comfortable for me. And then over time, I got more comfortable speaking in the moment because I had gotten like, validation and positive feedback from those times that I had like, shared my thoughts, after the fact.
I love that. Yeah, I'm thinking of a couple team members who I'm trying to encourage to speak more during meetings, but it is a big step going from not really speaking to here's my idea. Like there's
Yeah,
a
it's
couple different
scary.
layers there.
So yeah, I think it doesn't necessarily have to be in the moment, but like, yeah, like, and again, people process information differently. I definitely like to, yeah, need some time to kind of synthesize thoughts in my head before I share them. And so that was like a middle step for me.
Yeah. What's one book you'd recommend where people read?
Yeah, so this one is a marketing book that I read last year. It's called RED Marketing, the three ingredients of leading brands. RED stands for relevance, ease, and distinction. And it's co-written by the former CEO and CMO of Yum Brands, which owns Taco Bell.
Oh, yeah.
Taco Bell
Yeah.
has amazing marketing and advertising. And so they basically kind of talk about how they turn the brand around, and how that kind of impacted, re-accelerated sales for them. And so even though it's a consumer, brand, I think there's a lot of relevant takeaways for B2B marketers. So yeah, highly recommend that one.
Yeah, I think B2B marketing could learn a lot from consumer marketing.
Yeah, for sure.
It'll make it more interesting.
Yeah.
All right. Last question here is, where can people find you on the internet?
I am on LinkedIn, so people can follow me there. Otherwise, and this is kind of, I think, ironic for a content person, I'm like pretty much not on the internet. So find me on LinkedIn.
I understand that. I can relate. Awesome. Well, Jenny, it was a pleasure to have you on the show. Thanks for making the time.
Yeah, thank you so much. This was fun.